September 19, 1944. The mist over Lorraine rolled like smoke from some ancient cauldron, thick and silver, swallowing the hills and fields near the French village of Arracourt. You couldn't see 50 yards ahead, just the faint outlines of hedgerows, the ghostly silhouettes of tanks idling in silence. Inside one of them, 5 men sat cramped in the steel belly of a Sherman. The engine throbbed under their boots, its warmth mixing with the sour smell of oil, sweat, and fear. They had been told to hold the line, but against what no one knew for sure. The radio crackled with faint orders. Somewhere out there, German Panthers were moving through the fog. And not just any Panthers. The Germans were laughing, not within earshot, but across their own radios, through the mocking confidence that rolled ahead of their columns. To them, the Sherman was a joke, thin-skinned, undergunned, a toy tank built by a nation of assembly lines and farmers. The Panther, on the other hand, was the pinnacle of engineering. Sleek, deadly, armored like a fortress. When word spread that only 5 American Shermans were covering the ridge near Arracourt, German officers joked that it would be over before breakfast. One German tanker, years later, recalled how they'd been told the Americans drove coffins, not tanks. Inside one of those coffins, Sergeant James Farrell ran his thumb along the worn grip of his periscope handle, eyes fixed on the blank whiteness ahead. The gunner, Corporal Mason, muttered something about not being able to hit what he couldn't see. The loader, Delaney, laughed dryly. Then we'll just shoot the fog and hope it bleeds. The commander, Lieutenant Harold King, didn't reply. He was listening to the static, to the faraway rumble that could have been thunder or the sound of German armor rolling through the valley. The air outside was dead still. Then the wind shifted, carrying a low metallic growl. King's stomach tightened. Panthers, he whispered. You could feel them before you saw them. Each one weighing 45 tons. Their engines deep and slow like heartbeats through the earth. Somewhere beyond the fog, dozens of German tanks were advancing, their commanders certain they were about to crush the remnants of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. King glanced at his men. 5 tanks. That's it. We hold until reinforcements arrive. The absurdity hung in the air like the smoke from a match. 5 Shermans against dozens of Panthers. Even in training, the odds had never looked this bad. But war rarely cared about arithmetic. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and outarmored. The Panther's 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman at over 1,000 meters. The Sherman's own 75mm gun had to get dangerously close, sometimes within 500 yards, to find a weak spot. But what the Shermans had was something invisible yet deadly: coordination. Every tank carried a radio, and every crew could talk, move, and react as one. The Germans, proud of their discipline, still relied on hand signals, flags, and delayed orders. In clear weather, the Panthers' superior optics ruled the battlefield. But in fog, that advantage meant nothing. King's voice came through calm but sharp. We've got one shot at this. Delaney, load he. Mason, when you see muzzle flash, fire at the dirt beneath it. Let the fog be our friend. Outside, the world was white silent except for the ticking engines and the faint squeal of metal tracks somewhere unseen. Then came a flash. A German shell screamed past, exploding in a shower of mud 30 yards away. The ground trembled. There! King shouted. Mason fired. The Sherman's cannon roared, recoiling with a deep metallic thud. The round vanished into the mist. No confirmation, only the echo. A minute later, a second explosion, muffled, distant, rolled back through the fog. Then another. Farrell peered through his periscope and saw the faint black outline of a turret burning. The first Panther was down. Mason whooped, half in disbelief. We got one. We actually got one. King didn't celebrate. They'll be angrier now, he said. Stay low, keep moving. To the Germans, it must have felt like ghosts were shooting at them. Every time a Panther fired, a shell came back from nowhere, tearing through the side of its armor or detonating near its treads. The fog made range-finding useless. The Americans moved, fired, and vanished again, radio-coordinated phantoms in the mist. But inside the Shermans, it wasn't courage they felt. It was raw, shaking adrenaline. Every man knew one hit could turn his tank into a coffin. The Sherman's armor wasn't thick enough to survive a direct hit. If the shell ignited the fuel or ammunition, the crew wouldn't have time to scream. That's why many of them kept the hatches cracked open, to have a chance to jump out if fire came. It was war reduced to seconds. Farrell felt the next impact before he heard it. The shockwave slammed through the hull, throwing Delaney against the wall. "We're hit." But it didn't penetrate. Mason shouted, voice cracking. Smoke filled the interior. King coughed through the haze, eyes watering. "Move! Back 10 yards. New position." The tank lurched backward, treads grinding mud. Outside, another Panther fired. The shell screamed overhead, missing by a hair. Farrell saw it, just a flicker in the fog, but enough to mark the shooter's position. "Bearing 240, he shouted. Mason swung the turret, muscles straining. King gave the order. The Sherman fired again. This time, the fog lit up orange for half a heartbeat. A burning silhouette rose, its turret spinning as flames licked through its hatches. The second Panther was gone. By now, German officers were furious. The Americans should have been destroyed. Instead, their Panthers were dying, one by one, to an enemy they couldn't even see. Reports from forward scouts were incoherent. Some claimed hundreds of Shermans were hidden in the fog. In truth, there were still only 5, but they were fighting like 50. At headquarters, a German colonel slammed his fist on the map. "Impossible! The Shermans can't do this." But they could, and they were. The difference wasn't steel. It was strategy. The Americans were communicating, adapting, hunting together. Each Sherman relayed enemy positions by radio, creating a shifting web of information that turned confusion into control. Hours dragged. The fog thinned just enough for the sun to break through. The battlefield revealed itself. A nightmare of burning tanks, black smoke curling skyward, fields cratered with shellfire. Farrell looked out through the periscope and saw twisted hulks of Panthers smoldering like beasts brought down in a hunt. The laughter of the night before had vanished. King exhaled, voice steady but exhausted. 5 Shermans still rolling. The silence that followed wasn't victory, it was disbelief. No one had expected to live through the morning. No one had expected to win. Yet somehow they had held the line. From across the field, faintly carried by the wind, came the sound of retreating engines. The Germans were pulling back. Somewhere in the haze, one of the American crewmen whispered, half to himself, "Guess they're not laughing anymore." The irony hung in the air, heavy and electric. By noon, the fog had lifted. The smoke had not. And the world would soon know that on this nameless French hill, 5 so-called toy tanks had done the impossible. 5 Shermans, dozens of Panthers, fog, fear, and one of WWII's greatest upsets. The battle that made steel legends bleed. The morning after that first clash, Arracourt was a ghost town wrapped in mist and the smell of burning metal. What had begun as a skirmish had turned into a full-scale test of will and endurance. The men in the Shermans hadn't slept. Their uniforms were stained with smoke and sweat, their hands blistered from the heat of shell casings. The fog still hung over the French countryside like a curtain, muffling every sound but the distant coughs of engines and the dull thuds of artillery. Somewhere beyond the haze, the Germans were regrouping. They were angry, embarrassed, and determined to erase the humiliation of the day before. Lieutenant Harold King wiped the condensation from his periscope and stared into the blank whiteness. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel something, pressure, like a storm brewing underground. His radio hissed. The voice of another Sherman commander, Lieutenant Bruce Taylor, came through the static. "They're moving again. Whole columns. We counted at least 30, maybe more. They're coming straight through the valley." King's reply was quiet. "Then we'll make them pay for every yard." To the Americans, the fog had become both a curse and a blessing. It hid them, but it also blinded them. Tanks were meant to fight at range, but here at Arracourt battles were happening at point-blank distance. Ambushes, sudden flashes, death from invisible hands. The Shermans had no choice but to adapt. They dug into ditches, hid behind barns, lined up along hedgerows. And then they waited. At dawn, the Germans advanced again. A full battalion of Panthers and Mark IVs rolled through the valley, their treads crushing the wet soil, their engines echoing through the mist. They believed the American resistance was broken, that the lucky fog would no longer protect them. But they underestimated the Americans' growing mastery of that chaos. The secret wasn't the tank. It was the coordination. Every Sherman crew could talk instantly with the others, and with the infantry and artillery units behind them. Every gunner knew not only where he was firing, but where his comrades were. That invisible network, the hum of voices over the radio, turned the Shermans into one organism. King spoke softly into his mic, "Hold fire. Let them come closer." The German column, unseen but clearly audible, was now less than 200 yards away. The sound of tracks was rhythmic, mechanical, like an approaching heartbeat. Then came a shout from Farrell. "Visual on 2. Panthers, front." Mason adjusted his aim. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "Target locked." King exhaled. "Fire." The cannon barked. The shell punched into the fog, followed by a thunderclap of explosion. A dark shape emerged, one panther crawling to a halt, black smoke pouring from its turret. Another turned sharply, trying to locate the source of fire. That hesitation was all it took. Taylor's Sherman, positioned on the flank, fired next. A hit. Another panther burned. The valley erupted in chaos. German tanks began firing wildly into the mist, shells shrieking overhead. Trees splintered. A barn collapsed in flames. The air was filled with dust, mud, and the choking stench of cordite. Yet the Shermans moved with uncanny precision. Every time a German muzzle flash appeared, American gunners zeroed in, firing from cover, then shifting position before a counterstrike could find them. But victory came at a cost. Taylor's tank took a direct hit to the side. The shell penetrated the hull, igniting the fuel. The explosion was deafening. King's crew watched helplessly as the Sherman burst into flames, the turret hatch blowing open like a mouth gasping for air. Through the smoke, they saw silhouettes scrambling out, some burning, some falling. Farrell turned away, jaw clenched. Delaney whispered a prayer. King didn't move. He couldn't. "Keep firing," was all he said. The loss cut deep, but it also hardened them. The fog that had once seemed suffocating now became their shield. They used it like a weapon: hit, move, vanish. One tank fired, the others listened, marked coordinates, and trapped the Germans in a web of crossfire. Further down the valley, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding officer of the 37th Tank Battalion, was coordinating the larger defense. His voice came over the net, crisp and confident. "Don't trade shots, boys. Make 'em chase you. Let their pride do the killing." Abrams understood something the Germans didn't. That technology was nothing without flexibility. The Panther was powerful but rigid. Its heavy armor, narrow tracks, and slow turret made it clumsy in tight, foggy terrain. The Sherman, lighter and more agile, could pivot, relocate, and strike before the Panther could even turn its gun. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing a landscape torn apart by war. The fields were gouged with craters, the wreckage of Panthers and Shermans scattered across the valley. Smoke curled in the sunlight. The sound of gunfire became intermittent, like the last beats of a dying heart. King climbed halfway out of the hatch, scanning the horizon with binoculars. He saw movement, 3 Panthers advancing along a ridge to the south. 3 at 2 o'clock, he said. Mason rotated the turret, gears grinding. The radio buzzed again. Another crew reporting their position. "We'll flank him," King replied. "Keep low." The Shermans advanced through the orchard, treads crushing fallen apples, branches scraping their hulls. They crept forward like hunters stalking prey. The Panthers were focused elsewhere, aiming downhill at what they thought was the main American line. King waited until they turned broadside. Then he gave the order. "Now!" The first shot struck home, hitting the lead Panther in the side. Flames burst through the turret ring. The second Sherman fired a split second later, the round slamming into the second Panther's rear armor. A violent explosion followed, sending debris raining over the field. The third German tank swung around, firing blindly, but too late. Farrell's voice cracked as he shouted, "Direct hit!" It was a masterpiece of coordination, a symphony of steel and courage. 5 Shermans working as one had just destroyed a German spearhead of 3 Panthers without losing a single man. Yet the cost was visible everywhere. Burning tanks dotted the countryside like funeral pyres. Wounded men lay beside them, calling out through the haze. The medics moved quietly, expressionless, carrying the living away from the wrecks. King sat back inside his tank, staring at the floor. His hands were trembling. "How many?" he asked quietly. 27 Panthers down so far," Farrell answered. "We lost 7. The silence that followed was heavy. Mason finally broke it. "7's not bad for a miracle." Delaney smirked weakly. "Maybe we're ghosts after all." But there was no triumph in their voices, only exhaustion. They knew the Germans would come again, angrier, heavier, determined to crush this stubborn patch of earth. Still, something had changed. The laughter was gone. The mockery had turned to disbelief. That night, the fog returned, thicker than before. The Shermans huddled close, engines idling softly, their crews speaking in low voices. Some cleaned their guns. Others stared into the darkness, thinking of home. King wrote a few words in his notebook. "We weren't supposed to win, but maybe that's why we did." Outside, across the valley, German engineers were repairing tanks by lamplight. Officers barked orders, desperate to regain their shattered pride. They didn't yet realize what had truly beaten them. Not the guns, not the armor, but the invisible web of communication, courage, and adaptation that turned 5 American tanks into a wall of ghosts. The radio crackled one last time before midnight. "King, hold position," came Abrams' voice. "Reinforcements on the way. You boys just wrote yourselves into history." King didn't smile. He simply leaned back, closing his eyes as the fog pressed against the hull once more. The laughter of the enemy had vanished into smoke. But the storm was far from over. The question hung over every man still alive in those fields of fire. How long could 5 Shermans keep defying the impossible? By the 3rd day, the fog had begun to lift from Lorraine, revealing what war really looked like when the mist peeled away. The ground was littered with wreckage. Blackened shells of Panthers, twisted metal from trucks, and the smoldering remains of American Shermans that hadn't been lucky enough to move fast. The smell was everywhere. Fuel, fire, and the sickly sweetness of burned paint. The Battle of Arracourt was no longer a scattered ambush. It had become a decisive confrontation. And against all logic, the Americans were winning. The Germans came again at dawn, this time with fury. Columns of armor rolled through the valley, supported by artillery and aircraft, determined to crush what they still believed was a small, battered American force. But the U.S. 4th Armored Division had learned fast. Their tanks were now positioned in a wide arc across the hills, hidden behind hedgerows, haystacks, and smoke screens laid by their own artillery. They no longer fought like defenders. They fought like hunters. Inside Lieutenant Harold King's Sherman, the crew was silent except for the hum of the radio and the ticking of the turret motor. Farrell adjusted his periscope, scanning the horizon. Movement 3 Panthers, 200 yards, northeast ridge. King nodded, his voice steady. "Copy. Hold fire. Wait until they expose their flanks." The sun cut through the haze just enough to paint the valley in gold and gray. Across the field, the Panthers looked like dark beasts awakening. Their commanders were confident, sure that their long-barreled 75mm guns would turn the tide. But this wasn't open ground anymore, it was a chessboard. Abrams' voice came through the net again, cool and sharp as always. "Remember speed and coordination. Let them think you're retreating. Then hit 'em where it hurts." Every Sherman knew his place in the dance. The Germans advanced methodically, fanning out, their turrets scanning. The first Panther fired. Its shell hit a barn, showering the field with debris. The second fired, missing by inches. King waited until they crossed the ridgeline. Then he gave the order. Now! The valley erupted. From 3 hidden positions, the Shermans fired almost simultaneously. Mason's round punched through the first Panther's side armor, the explosion so violent it threw the turret clear off the hull. Farrell reloaded in seconds. The second round slammed into the next German tank, setting off its ammunition. The third Panther fired back wildly, its shot ricocheting into a hedgerow. Taylor's replacement crew, dug in farther down the slope, responded instantly. 1 hit, then silence. For the first time, the Germans realized they weren't fighting a disorganized retreat. They were being hunted. American radio coordination turned chaos into orchestration. 1 tank spotted, another flanked, a third finished the kill. The Shermans moved constantly, shifting positions after every shot, using their speed and the terrain to turn heavier enemies into sitting ducks. By midday, the sky roared with another threat, Luftwaffe aircraft diving through the clouds. But even there, fortune favored the Americans. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down from above, strafing the German columns. To the men on the ground, it was a symphony of fire. The deep growl of engines, the crack of cannons, the whistle of bombs. The Germans' perfect armored formation disintegrated into confusion. Tanks collided, commanders shouted, orders were lost in the static. King's crew pressed forward. Their tank shook with each shot, the recoil hammering their ribs. Sweat dripped from their helmets, mixing with the soot that covered their faces. The smell of hot metal filled the air. Farrell saw another Panther crest the ridge, its gun swinging toward them. "It's got us," he yelled. Mason aimed fast, firing before the German could. The shot hit low, exploding beneath the turret. The Panther's gun froze mid-turn, then detonated. Flames burst from its hatches like a dragon breathing its last. Across the line, the same story repeated. Panthers fell one after another, outmaneuvered by smaller, nimbler Shermans that struck and vanished like ghosts. Some German crews abandoned their tanks altogether, fleeing on foot through the smoke. By late afternoon, the radio filled with disbelief. "We've counted 60 confirmed enemy kills," one voice reported. Abrams answered without emotion. "Keep going. Don't stop until they're running." It was no longer defense, it was domination. The numbers told the story better than any headline could. In just a few days, American tankers destroyed over 281 German tanks and assault guns while losing only 25 of their own. It was one of the most lopsided armored victories in history. The German 5th Panzer Army, once confident of sweeping through Lorraine, was shattered. But numbers didn't capture what it felt like from inside the steel. Every man in King's crew knew that survival came down to seconds. Mason's ears rang from constant firing. Delaney's arms ached from handling shells. Farrell's throat burned from smoke. They were alive only because they moved faster, thought quicker, trusted each other completely. When one Sherman got hit, the others didn't panic, they avenged. At one point, King's tank crested a ridge and found itself face-to-face with 2 Panthers at 50 yards. The world seemed to stop. The first German shell screamed past, missing by inches. Mason fired instantly. The recoil slammed them back. The Panther's turret exploded outward, flames shooting skyward. The second Panther fired but hit the wreck of its ally instead. King barked orders. "Advance!" The Sherman charged forward, firing on the move, its guns spitting flame. The second Panther burned within seconds. Later, they'd call it the Dance of Ghosts. When the smoke finally cleared, the battlefield looked like an industrial graveyard. Rows of German armor lay silent, their black hulls twisted and scorched. Crows circled above the wrecks. The Americans, too, had losses, but far fewer than anyone had imagined possible. Abrams himself drove through the carnage, his jeep weaving between burning tanks. He radioed a simple report: "Enemy armor neutralized. We're still standing." German survivors were stunned. Captured officers spoke in disbelief. One major told his interrogators, "It wasn't your tanks. It was your radios. You fought like one machine." That statement would become legendary, proof that communication, not armor, had won Arracourt. For the U.S. soldiers, the victory was surreal. Farrell leaned out of the hatch, staring at the horizon. Smoke drifted over the ridges, the sun dipping low behind it. "We did it," he murmured. Mason laughed, hollow but proud. "5 Shermans," he said, shaking his head. 5 Shermans just crushed the pride of the Wehrmacht. King said nothing. He watched as medics carried away the wounded, as mechanics dragged disabled tanks from the mud. His men were heroes now, though none of them felt like it. The price was etched into their faces. Every flash, every scream, every tank that didn't come back. Still, the irony couldn't be ignored. The Germans had mocked the Shermans, calling them Tommy Cookers and death traps. Now, the so-called inferior tanks had broken the backbone of their armored force. That night, the radio went quiet. Only the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the faint crackle of distant fires. King climbed out of his tank and stood on the ridge, the glow of burning Panthers reflecting in his eyes. "Somewhere behind him," Farrell said softly. "Guess we're not the joke anymore." King looked out toward the fields where so many had fallen. "No," he said, "but someone else will be." The laughter of the enemy had turned to silence, and the legend of Arracourt was born. 5 Shermans, dozens of Panthers. They called them toys, but the toys burned tigers. When the smoke finally drifted away from the hills of Arracourt, the land looked less like France and more like another planet, scarred, silent, and littered with steel skeletons. Burned tanks lay at every angle, their turrets blown open, their armor blackened and split like volcanic rock. The battle had ended, but the sound of it seemed to hang in the air. The echo of engines, the thunder of guns, the hiss of fires that still hadn't gone out. The men who'd survived moved through the wreckage in silence. They weren't cheering. They weren't boasting. They were simply alive, and that felt like enough. Lieutenant Harold King climbed down from his Sherman, boots sinking into the wet, churned soil. His hands were black with oil and gunpowder. He'd been awake for more than 60 hours, but his mind wouldn't rest. Around him, medics moved between the wrecks, checking for anyone still breathing. Mechanics inspected tanks, noting which ones could be repaired and which would be left behind forever. The morning sun glowed dull and red through the haze, like it was rising through smoke instead of sky. The Germans were gone. What remained of their once proud 5th Panzer Army had retreated east, leaving hundreds of tanks behind. The American soldiers walked among them like archaeologists of war, tracing bullet holes with their fingers, marveling that 5 Shermans had stood against so many Panthers and lived to tell it. One private muttered, "They laughed at us, called us tin cans." Another replied, "Well, the cans bit back." Reports began to trickle in that afternoon. General Patton's staff relayed the numbers. Over 281 German tanks and assault guns destroyed, while only 25 Shermans were lost. It was one of the most decisive armored victories in U.S. history. Yet King knew numbers didn't tell the real story. They didn't show Mason's trembling hands when he fired his last round. They didn't record the moment Farrell whispered a prayer as shells screamed overhead. They didn't capture the faces of the men who didn't come back, their helmets still lying in the mud beside their burned-out tanks. Creighton Abrams arrived at the ridge before noon, his jeep weaving between the craters. He stepped out, lit a cigarette, and surveyed the battlefield. When he spoke, it was quiet, almost reverent. "You boys just proved what I've been saying all along," he said. "It ain't the tank that wins the fight. It's the crew that fights inside it." King nodded, exhausted. "We just did what we had to." Abrams smiled faintly. "That's what heroes always say." Back at headquarters, German commanders were still trying to understand what had gone wrong. Their reports blamed the weather, the terrain, the fog, anything but their own arrogance. They had believed the Panthers' thick armor made them invincible. They had trusted their firepower to crush everything in front of them. What they hadn't understood was that war had changed. The Americans didn't fight by the old rules. They fought with communication, speed, and unity. Radios had turned every Sherman into a node in a living network, a moving organism that could see and strike faster than any single machine. One German officer reportedly said after the battle, "It was not the Shermans that beat us. It was the invisible web between them." That phrase spread among captured tankers, whispered with disbelief. They had mocked the enemy's talkative tanks, but now they envied them. King's men spent the next day burying their fallen. The soil was soft and dark, and the graves were shallow. The chaplain said a few words, his voice cracking as he spoke. The soldiers stood in silence, caps off, faces grim. When it was over, no one moved for a long time. Mason finally broke the stillness. "We won," he said quietly. "So why does it feel like we lost something?" That question lingered, because victory at Arracourt hadn't felt like triumph, it had felt like survival. Each man knew how close they'd come to dying, how fragile their victory had been. The thin steel walls of the Sherman had protected them just enough to stay alive, but it was their trust in each other that had carried them through. As the weeks passed, news of the battle spread through the Allied ranks. To some, it was a miracle. To others, a turning point. Arracourt became proof that the myth of German invincibility was finally broken. The Wehrmacht's best armor had been defeated not by superior machines but by the courage and coordination of ordinary men. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's armor dominance in the West. When reporters later asked one of Abrams's officers how they'd pulled it off, he said, "The Germans had the better tanks. We had better teamwork." That single sentence became the lesson of Arracourt, a truth that echoed far beyond the war. Weeks later, when rain fell over Lorraine, the fields turned to mud again, covering the scars of battle. Farmers would eventually return, plowing their land around the rusting hulks of Panthers and Shermans. Kids would climb on the abandoned wrecks, not knowing they stood on the graves of men who had changed the course of the war. For the tankers, life moved on, but the memories stayed sharp. Farrell often woke at night hearing the metallic clang of shells hitting armor, even in dreams. Mason couldn't stand silence anymore. He kept a small radio by his bed just to hear static. King was promoted, but he never stopped carrying the same small notebook where he had written his line during the battle. "We weren't supposed to win. But maybe that's why we did." In the years that followed, historians would call Arracourt a textbook example of tactical brilliance. They'd write about Abrams's leadership, about the efficiency of American logistics, about the evolution of radio warfare. But to the men who had been there, it wasn't about textbooks or strategy. It was about moments, the smell of diesel, the sound of rain hitting metal, the heartbeat you could hear through the floor of the tank. It was about 5 men inside a machine built for 6, breathing the same smoke and trusting each other with their lives. The irony returned in full when, months later, a captured German officer was shown a photo of the wrecked battlefield. He stared at it for a long time before saying, almost to himself, "We laughed at their tanks. We should have feared their minds." That line made its way into American newspapers. It became a symbol of the shift that had occurred not only in the war, but in warfare itself. Strength no longer came from thickness of armor, but from the speed of communication, the clarity of teamwork, and the courage to adapt when the world fell apart. As Europe moved toward liberation, the veterans of Arracourt carried that lesson with them. Some went on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, others returned home and tried to rebuild their lives. They rarely spoke of what they had done because heroes seldom do. But whenever they gathered in reunions years later, one story always came up: the fog, the laughter, and the day it stopped. Harold King, older and grayer, was once asked what he remembered most. He thought for a while before answering. "The quiet," he said, "after it was over. When you realized the world had changed, and you were still breathing." History would remember Arracourt as a triumph of courage and innovation. But for the men who lived it, it was a reminder of something deeper. That even when mocked, underestimated, or outnumbered, the human spirit finds ways to adapt, to outthink, to endure. Machines rust, heroes fade, but ideas, teamwork, trust, courage, don't burn as easily. The insult that had started it all, that the Sherman was a joke, a rolling coffin, was now used with pride. Veterans would say it with a grin. "Yeah, we drove coffins, but they carried ghosts that haunted the enemy." In the end, the Battle of Arracourt wasn't just about tanks. It was about transformation, of warfare, of morale, of what it meant to be underestimated and still prevail. The fog had lifted not just from the battlefield, but from the myth of German invincibility. King once stood again on that ridge years later, long after the war, when the grass had grown tall around the rusted remains of his old tank. The silence was complete. He placed his hand on the cold steel and whispered, "You did your job." Then he looked to the horizon, where the fog began to rise again, curling softly through the valley, and he smiled, a small, knowing smile. "They laughed at 5 Shermans," he said quietly, "until they crushed dozens of Panthers." And then, as the wind carried the smoke of memory into the sky, the question hung in the air, unanswered but eternal. Which modern machine, born in arrogance today, will be humbled in the same way tomorrow?